what you just spoke about, I think intimately ties into it, of course. You have said that Texas is where the Old South meets the Wild West. And you've also said that Texas is to the United States as the United States is to the rest of the world. Texas as this kind of epicenter of US fascism and maybe even influential in fascism abroad. Can you unpack this history a bit for us and maybe give an overview of your work here with regard to counter-revolution, war with Mexico, annexation, Civil War, Jim Crow, and so on?
Well, first of all, with regard to Texas, the United States, as the United States is to the world, keep in mind that with regard to circumscribing the reproductive freedoms of women in this country, Texas was in the vanguard, I'm afraid to say, by setting up this bounty whereby you could turn in a woman and those who have assisted her in reproductive freedom and claim $10,000, perhaps more. With regards to the attack on critical race theory, which I'm afraid to say uh, this Kathy Lou character and these critics of the 1619 Project are feeding into this attack on critical race theory, which many of them are not able to define. Speaking of the Texas legislators, it's once again, it's unease with teaching the history of slavery and indigenous dispossession to little Johnny and little Jennifer, because it'll cause them to be discombobulated. And so you don't necessarily want to say that. And so you instead rail against something like critical race theory, which people don't know what you're talking about. With regard to Texas and the international right, you might have noticed that Viktor Orban, the strongman in Budapest, was just in Dallas a few weeks ago, rallying the troops. There is this global right. You can see it in the career and trajectory of Steve Bannon, the former Trump consigliere, for example. And with regard to where the Old South meets the Wild West, obviously what I'm referring to is that Texas was a major slave state. As I paint the picture, it was a bulwark of the so-called Confederate States of America when they seceded in 1861 in order to perpetuate this system of having unpaid workers for evermore. And it's no accident that as a result, you see Texas has the largest Black population in the United States today, which has a manifold consequence. But Texas was also the epicenter of what's referred to somehow as the quote Wild West, that is to say, the genocide against the indigenous population, because the settlers in Texas faced a very extraordinary challenge. What I mean is that they had some of the most fearsome and militant indigenous groupings to combat if they were going to plunder them and take their land. Of course, our friends due north in what's called Dakota territory, or speaking of the Lakota people, may challenge what I'm about to say about the Comanches and their fearsomeness, not to mention the people we call the Lipan Apaches of West Texas, not to mention the Kiowa, Kiowa, who eventually migrated in mass south of the border to Mexico, and not to mention the Caddo, Caddo, who had an interlocking directorate with Black people. And so this presented a very fearsome challenge to the settlers. And so what happens is that the liberals, connect this to our previous discussion about James Sweet and Kathy Lou et al. The liberals in Washington, their preferred option for the Native American question was reservations. That was the liberal position, Bantustan. So that's the origins, of course, of what preceded Oklahoma, which becomes a state in 1907, speaking of Indian territory, so-called, which was slated to be, in South African terms, a Bantustan. That is to say, the land of the Indians, for as long as the river shall flow and the grass shall grow. And therefore, you have the curious case of the Cherokee, formerly of the Southeast Quadrant of North America, who seek to assimilate. And to me, this is a paradigmatic example of the toxicity of white supremacy and US racism, which, of course, some of our friends on the left have difficulty grappling with. Because the Cherokee, many of them converted to Christianity, many of them became agriculturalists in the mode of the European settlers. Many of them adopted the sartorial choices, not unlike the settlers. Many of them enslaved Africans. They still had to go. And so in the 1820s, in the early 1830s, they were forced to embark on the so-called Trail of Tears, whereby they had to make it or hoof it hundreds of miles away to what is now Oklahoma from what had been their residences in Georgia. In fact, it was a sort of roughhouse Airbnb, whereby European settlers just off the boat move into their mansions and evict and eject them as they have to embark on the Trail of Tears. And that, in many ways, it seems to me, that is one of the most illustrative examples of the profundity of settler colonialism and all of its naked racism that has existed to this point. And indeed, as I tried to suggest with the subtitle of this book, I don't think you can begin to understand what even the chief executive in the White House is referring to as, quote, semi-fascism. I guess that's sort of a hedge. You cannot begin to understand this phenomenon without understanding settler colonialism, as already noted, which was a multi-class project, was a project that tended to exemplify class collaboration and was a project in which the unpaid workers, just to clarify, to speak of enslaved Africans, if I can use that term, what was the interest in enslaved Africans engaging in class collaboration with their slave masters? But in order to construct this narrative that has us all today on the sort of same page, I guess, where we're supposed to be uniting hands against some foe. I hope it's not China. But that's sort of a fantasy, because we weren't uniting hands necessarily before 1865. And in fact, let me refer your audience to this piece I wrote. You can easily find it online, called Against Left-Wing White Nationalism, where I point out that the class collaboration amongst the settler class oftentimes involved that class, settler class, being deputized to ride herd on Black people. And that, in other words, if an enslaved person escapes, perhaps the deputy can get some sort of bounty for returning them, for example. So there are all these complexities of settler colonialism as it exists in the United States, but folks, I guess they don't want to deal with the complexity. I guess it's more soothing and satisfying to raise the false flag of identity politics, even though, interestingly enough, when they're talking about identity politics, what they're really talking about is the legacy of class solidarity amongst the unpaid working group. And that class solidarity then exists to this very day, insofar as the group you're excoriating tends to vote against the right wing at a higher proportion than any other demographic, 8-2, 9-1. Yet that's your target. As you go along making excuses, even up to and including what happens in Louisiana in 1991, when David Duke, a Nazi and a Klansman, runs for governor and gets 55% of the Euro-American vote across class lines. I guess the left would tell us, well, maybe if the opposition had come out in favor of revolution or socialism or the Green New Deal, these people wouldn't have voted for fascism. Well, that's the sort of argument that will keep us busy if we're not careful in the concentration camps for decades to come.